You all are seriously wasting my time with this. I did absolutely nothing wrong.
I have occupied this seat for 38 years. 38 years of watching the human parade march through these heavy oak doors. Some people come in here with their heads bowed by the weight of the world, others with their fists clenched in a rage they don't quite understand. I've seen the best of us, and I've seen the absolute worst, often hidden behind the same suit or the same smile. After nearly 4 decades, you begin to believe that you've seen every possible shade of the human condition. You think your heart has grown a callus thick enough that no story could ever truly pierce it again. I was wrong. There was a cold Monday morning last November that I still carry with me, a day that reminded me why the word justice must never become just a hollow echo in a marble hallway. It began like any other day. I wake up at 5 a.m. sharp. My wife, Sarah, has teased me for years that I have the internal clock of a man who is afraid to miss the sunrise. I take my coffee black, as bitter as a hard truth, just the way my father taught me. My father was a man who spent 40 years working in a textile mill, a man who believed that a person's word was their most valuable currency and that respect was something you earned with your sweat, not something you bought with a checkbook. He used to tell me, "Boyd, the law is a mirror. It doesn't care how much gold you're wearing. It only shows you exactly who you are." By 8 a.m., I am at the courthouse on 4th Street. It is an old building. The floors are a bit uneven, and the heating system groans like a tired giant, but it has a soul. My clerk, Elena, was already there, her desk organized with the kind of military precision that only 20 years of service can produce. She handed me the docket, and her expression was tighter than usual. She didn't say a word. She just tapped the second file on the stack. I looked down at the name, Julian Vane. Beside it, the name of the complainant, Elias Thorne. At first glance, it looked like a standard obstruction case, a minor dispute over a restricted access zone. But Elena's eyes told me there was a storm brewing beneath the ink. As I took the bench and looked out over the gallery, the contrast in the room was almost physical. In the far corner sat Elias Thorne. He was 82 years old, wearing a faded green field jacket with a Vietnam veteran cap pulled low over his eyes. He sat with a stillness that only comes to men who have survived things they don't talk about. His hands, gnarled by age and hard labor, were folded neatly in his lap. He looked like a man who was prepared to wait an eternity for what was right. And then there was Julian Vane. He was 24, sitting in the front row with his legs crossed at the ankle, leaning back as if he were at a private club rather than a court of law. His suit was a charcoal pinstripe that probably cost more than Elias Thorne's first house. He was on his phone, his thumb moving rapidly, a faint, bored smile playing on his lips. He was the picture of effortless privilege, a young man who had clearly never been told that the world didn't revolve around his convenience. The air around him felt expensive and hollow. I felt a familiar tightening in my chest, a quiet signal from my conscience that this wasn't going to be just another morning. I picked up my gavel, its weight feeling heavier than usual, and called the court to order. The clock on the courtroom wall struck 10:15 a.m. I took a deep breath, the scent of old wood and ancient paper, a scent I've inhaled for half a lifetime, filling my lungs. I opened Julian Vane's file. The black ink on the white pages felt like a direct challenge to the very concept of justice. Julian Vane hadn't just committed a traffic violation. He had treated the life and death priority of others as a mere playground for his ego. According to the police report, on the afternoon of November 14th, Julian had parked his custom purple McLaren 720S, a machine worth well over $300,000, directly in the restricted zone reserved for emergency vehicles and disabled veterans at the VA hospital. He left it there for 3 hours. In those 3 hours, Mr. Elias Thorne, sitting so quietly across the room now, faced an ordeal that no old soldier should ever have to endure. Elias had a critical appointment to check his lungs, a lingering debt from his years of service. Because Julian's car blocked the primary access, Elias was forced to get out of his transport 2 blocks away. In the freezing November rain, he had to struggle alone, lugging 2 heavy oxygen tanks for nearly a quarter of a mile just to reach the hospital doors. I looked up at Julian. He was still looking down at his phone, a faint, distracted smirk dancing on his lips as if he were reading a particularly amusing text. I tapped my gavel sharply against the bench. The dry sound echoed through the high-ceilinged room. Mr. Vane, I require you to put that phone away and stand up. We are in a court of law, not a VIP lounge in a downtown club. Julian rose slowly, smoothing the lapels of his expensive jacket with a face that showed absolutely no emotion. Arrogance radiated from his every movement, the way he stood, slightly tilted to one side, his eyes wandering toward me with a bored indifference. It all signaled his belief that he belonged to a class of people that common rules simply could not touch. Judge Boyd, Julian began, his voice smooth and confident to a disturbing degree. I understand there's been a minor misunderstanding regarding a parking spot. I've already told my counsel that I'm prepared to pay double or even triple the standard fine. I had an important meeting, and that was the only open spot I saw at the time. I really don't think we need to make such a spectacle out of this. I looked into his eyes, searching for even a flickering shadow of remorse, but all I found was the hollow emptiness of a soul nourished by bank balances rather than human values. You call forcing an 82-year-old veteran to carry oxygen tanks through the rain a minor misunderstanding. Mr. Vane? I asked, my voice low but carrying a heavy, vibrating pressure. I could feel the silence swallowing the room. Elena, my clerk, stopped her typing mid-sentence. Even the people in the gallery held their breath. Julian merely gave a slight, dismissive shrug. I didn't know he was going to show up at that exact moment. It was just an unlucky coincidence. In that moment, I saw the ghost of my father in Elias's tired eyes, the men who built this country with their blood and sweat, now being treated as inconveniences by children born with silver spoons in their mouths. My anger didn't flare up like a fire. It was cold, crystalline, and sharp. I knew right then that a financial penalty would never be enough for a man like this. Julian Vane didn't need a fine. He needed a lesson in empathy. And I, as the keeper of the scales, was going to ensure he received it in a way he never could have imagined. I turned to the next page of the file, where Elena had flagged a specific detail Julian thought I hadn't seen yet. The atmosphere in the room shifted at 11:30 a.m. Elena walked toward the bench with a look on her face I've seen only a few times in 20 years. It wasn't just stress. It was a profound, quiet disgust. She placed a single sheet of paper in front of me, face down. Judge, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Officer Miller pulled this from a public profile this morning. You need to see it before we proceed. I turned the page over. My hands, which have remained steady through thousands of trials, felt a sudden, icy chill. It was a high-resolution printout of an Instagram post from the account at Vane VIP, an account with nearly 80,000 followers. The timestamp was 4:12 p.m. on November 14th, the exact window when Elias Thorne was struggling for breath, hauling his oxygen tanks through the freezing rain. The photograph showed the rear end of that purple McLaren, parked at a defiant, careless angle across the red-painted ambulance-only lines. In the background, the hospital's emergency entrance was clearly visible, but it was the caption that made the blood in my veins turn to lead. It read, "Hospital dinner, LOL, parked in the hero zone because rules are for people who can't afford the fines." Security paged my plate 3 times. I didn't move. Why? Because my father owns the wing. Number untouchable, number Vane life, number don't care. I sat with that page for 90 seconds. In a courtroom, 90 seconds of absolute silence feels like an eternity. I was aware of the distant hum of the ventilation, the soft clicking of a radiator, and the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the gallery. Inside my head, I heard my father's voice again. He used to say, "Frank, a man who brags about stepping on those who can't step back isn't a man at all. He's a parasite living off a name he didn't build." I looked up from the paper and signaled to the court technician. "Project this on the main screen," I commanded. My voice was flat, devoid of the anger I was actually feeling, because I wanted the evidence to speak for itself. As the image flickered to life on the large monitor, a collective gasp rippled through the gallery. It wasn't a loud noise, but a sharp, involuntary intake of breath. I watched Julian Vane. For the first time that morning, the bored smirk vanished. He didn't look at the screen. He looked at his lawyer, Jeffrey Stone, who had suddenly turned a very pale shade of gray. I turned to Julian, my eyes locking onto his. "Mr. Vane," I said, the words falling like stones into a deep well. Is this your account? Did you, while an 82-year-old man who served this country was fighting for air less than 50 yards away, take the time to photograph your car and brag to 80,000 people that you were untouchable? Julian opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at the screen, then at the floor. The effortless confidence he had worn like a shield all morning was starting to crack, revealing a very small, very frightened boy underneath the $15,000 suit. Jeffrey Stone stood up quickly. Your Honor, my client would like to invoke his Fifth Amendment rights regarding this social media post. It was intended as a joke among friends, a satirical take on "Sit down, Mr. Stone," I interrupted. I didn't raise my voice, but the authority in it was absolute. The Fifth Amendment protects a man from self-incrimination, not from the consequences of his own public arrogance. This isn't a joke. It's a confession of character. I looked back at the screen, at the words, "Rules are for people who can't afford the fines." That single sentence was the key to everything. It was the why behind the crime. It was the proof that this wasn't an accident. It was a choice. The glow from the monitor eventually faded, but the image of that purple McLaren stayed burned into the collective consciousness of everyone in the room. I watched Julian Vane. The silence was no longer an absence of sound. It was a physical weight, 1,000 unspoken judgments pressing down on his shoulders. For the first time, his hands, the hands that had scrolled so confidently through his digital kingdom, were tucked under the table, gripping his knees. I could see a faint tremor in his shoulders. The untouchable shield wasn't just cracking, it was shattering. I looked at Elias Thorne. He wasn't looking at the screen. He wasn't looking at Julian. He was looking at his own hands, those gnarled, scarred hands that had seen things in the jungles of Vietnam that most of us only see in nightmares. He sat with a profound, quiet dignity that made Julian's $15,000 suit look like a cheap costume. Elias didn't want a scene. He didn't want revenge. He just wanted the world to be what he fought for, a place where respect meant more than a bank balance. Mr. Stone, I said, my voice echoing off the oak panels, you mentioned optics. You mentioned satire. Tell me, where is the punchline for a man who spent 20 years serving this country, who worked 40 years in a factory, and who now has to struggle for his next breath in a freezing parking lot because your client felt entitled to a closer spot for his dinner? Jeffrey Stone stood up, his professional mask slipping. Your Honor, we acknowledge the post was in poor taste. To show our sincerity, the Vane family is prepared to make an immediate donation of $50,000 to the VA hospital's respiratory wing. We believe this gesture reflects— Stop right there, Mr. Stone, I interrupted. I didn't raise my voice, but the sharpness of it cut through the room like a blade. In this courtroom, we don't trade checks for character. A donation is not a gesture of remorse, it's a transaction. You are trying to buy your way out of a moral debt that you haven't even begun to acknowledge. You seem to believe that because you can afford the fine, the law is merely a service you purchase. You are mistaken. This is not a marketplace. This is a house of justice. I turned my attention back to Julian. He finally looked up, and for a split second, I saw it not remorse, but a flicker of genuine fear. It was the fear of a person who has suddenly realized that the walls they built around themselves are not as high as they thought. Julian, I said, using his first name for the first time, you wrote that nobody touches a vein. You wrote that rules are for people who can't afford the fines. You looked at Mr. Thorne and saw an invisible man, but today he is the most important person in this room, and you are just a defendant who forgot that being a citizen is a responsibility, not a subscription service. I felt the weight of the gavel in my hand. The air in the courtroom felt charged, like the moment before a lightning strike. The mention of the $50,000 donation hung in the air, like a bribe that had been dressed up in a tuxedo. I saw Julian's face flicker with a momentary confusion. He truly, deeply believed that this was how the world worked, that every mistake had a price tag and every conscience could be silenced with a signature. When I said, "This is not a marketplace," I saw the first real crack in his composure. His eyes darted to the back of the room, searching for a shadow that wasn't there yet. He was looking for the protection that had followed him his entire life. I leaned forward, my elbows resting on the bench, my shadow falling over the documents in front of me. "Julian," I said, my voice dropping to a level that forced everyone in the room to lean in just to hear. I received a phone call in my chambers this morning. It wasn't from your lawyer. It was from a representative who claimed to speak for your family's interests. They used words like discretion and sensitivity. They suggested that a young man with your unlimited potential shouldn't have his future tarnished by a simple parking oversight that was being blown out of proportion by the media. I paused, letting the weight of that revelation settle. The gallery was so quiet I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the back wall. In my 38 years on this bench, I continued, I have found that potential is a word often used to excuse the behavior of people who have never had to face a single consequence. But potential without character is just a high-performance engine in a car with no steering wheel. It is dangerous, it is reckless, and eventually, it crashes. I turned my gaze away from the defendant and toward the man in the Vietnam veteran cap. Elias Thorne hadn't moved. He didn't look like a man who wanted a $50,000 donation. He didn't look like a man who cared about the Vane family's discretion. He looked like a man who wanted to be seen as a human being. Mr. Thorne, I said softly, you have been very patient. This court has heard from the lawyers and seen the digital evidence of Mr. Vane's perspective, but I want to hear from you. Is there anything you would like to say to this young man before I move to sentencing? Elias Thorne stood up slowly. It was a process, a series of small, calculated movements as his joints creaked, a sound that seemed to echo the decades of hard labor and sacrifice he had given to this country. He didn't look at me. He turned his body and looked directly at Julian Vane. He didn't yell. He didn't curse. He spoke in a voice that was thin, weathered by age, but as steady as a mountain stream. Son, Elias said, I don't want your money. I've lived 82 years without your family's charity, and I'll finish my time the same way. But when I was in that parking lot, struggling for every breath, I wasn't thinking about your car. I was thinking about my wife, who was waiting for me inside. I was thinking about making it to that doctor so I could have one more Christmas with my grandkids. To you, that spot was a convenience. To me, it was a lifeline. You didn't just take a parking space, Julian. You took a piece of my dignity, and there isn't a check in the world big enough to buy that back. Julian looked away. He couldn't meet the old man's eyes. The untouchable kid was starting to feel the heavy, cold gravity of a world that didn't care about his hashtag. I felt the atmosphere shift. The trial was no longer about a McLaren. It was about the soul of a young man who had lost his way in a forest of mirrors, and the veteran who was finally forcing him to look at the truth. The silence that followed Elias Thorne's words was different from any silence I had experienced in my 38 years on this bench. It wasn't the silence of a room waiting for a verdict. It was the silence of a room that had just witnessed a soul being stripped bare. Julian Vane sat perfectly still, his head bowed, his expensive charcoal suit suddenly looking like a weight he could no longer carry. But just as the weight of the moment seemed to reach its peak, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a sharp, calculated resonance. A woman entered. She didn't walk. She processed. Catherine Vane, 62 years old, the matriarch of the Vane Empire, and the sister-in-law of the very Senator Julian, had bragged about. She was draped in a charcoal Chanel suit that matched her son's, but her expression was carved from ice. She didn't look at Elias. She didn't look at me. She walked straight to the front row, her heels clicking against the floor with the precision of a metronome. She stood beside Julian, but there was no hand on his shoulder, no whisper of comfort. She looked at him with a gaze so cold it seemed to drop the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. Then she turned to the monitor, where the Instagram post, the one bragging about being untouchable, was still frozen in its digital arrogance. Julian, she said, her voice a sharp, cultured whip that carried to every corner of the gallery. Did you actually believe that the name I spent 30 years building was designed to protect this level of stupidity? You parked in an ambulance bay and bragged about it to 80,000 people? You used your uncle's name like a common shield? She didn't wait for him to answer. She turned to Jeffrey Stone, who was already gathering his papers with the frantic energy of a man who knew the ship was sinking. Mr. Stone, she said, her voice devoid of any warmth, you're fired. My office will settle your fee by the end of the business day. I will not have my family's reputation managed by someone who allows a client to commit suicide on a public record. The courtroom gasped. I watched Julian. The color drained from his face until he was the shade of old parchment. This was the moment the untouchable boy realized he was, in fact, very alone. He had counted on the family shield to deflect the world, but he hadn't realized that to a dynasty, a liability is something you don't protect, it's something you cut loose. Catherine Vane then looked at me. Your Honor, she said, her composure perfect. My brother-in-law, the senator, has no knowledge of this young man's digital exploits. The Vane family does not condone this behavior. Whatever sentence you deem appropriate, he will serve it. We are done here. She turned on her heel and walked out, the doors swinging shut behind her with a finality that sounded like a prison cell closing. Julian was left standing at the defense table, his mouth slightly open, looking like a boy who had just watched his entire world vanish in a puff of smoke. The swagger was gone. The arrogance was gone. All that was left was a 24-year-old who had never once had to stand somewhere without a shadow to hide in. I picked up my pen, ready to write the words that would change his life forever. The gavel remained on the bench, but the weight of it seemed to fill the entire courtroom. Julian Vane stood before me, no longer a millionaire heir with an untouchable digital kingdom, but a young man, stripped of his armor. His mother was gone. His lawyer was gone. The senator's name had been withdrawn like a flag in a storm. I looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't see an adversary. I saw a soul that had been blinded by the glare of its own privilege. I thought about my father's hands, scarred and rough, and then I looked at Julian's soft, manicured fingers. The contrast told the whole story. Julian, I began, my voice steady but infused with the cold clarity of a surgeon. You said you and Mr. Thorne are not equal in any meaningful way. You were right. You are not equal, but not for the reasons you think. Elias Thorne is worth 10 of you, not because of what he owns, but because of what he has given. He spent his youth in a jungle so you could spend yours in a McLaren. He carried a rifle so you could carry a designer briefcase. And when you blocked his path, you didn't just break a parking rule bypassing the law because you could afford the fine, you committed an act of moral cowardice. I picked up the sentencing form. The gallery leaned in, the air thick with anticipation. Here is the judgment of this court. First, you will pay the maximum statutory fine of $500. I know that is pocket change to you, so we are not stopping there. Second, your driver's license is hereby suspended for a period of 6 months. For the next half year, you will not be behind the wheel of a McLaren. You will walk, you will take the bus, you will experience the world from the pavement, just as Mr. Thorne had to do in the rain. I leaned forward, locking eyes with him. Third, you will complete 300 hours of community service. But you won't be picking up trash on a highway. You will report to the VA hospital, the very place you mocked. You will be assigned to the respiratory and mobility ward. You will assist veterans like Mr. Thorne. You will carry their oxygen tanks. You will push their wheelchairs. You will look into their eyes every single day for 300 hours and realize that they are the heroes, and you are merely a guest in the country they built. Julian's breath hitched. I wasn't done. And finally, about that Instagram post. Since you love your 80,000 followers so much, you will post a copy of this court's judgment. You will write a public apology, acknowledging your arrogance and explaining exactly why untouchable is a lie. That post will remain pinned to the top of your profile for 1 full year. If you delete it, if you hide it, or if you miss a single hour of service at that hospital, I will have you remanded to the county jail for the maximum term allowed by law. Do you understand? Julian looked at Elias, then back at me. A single tear tracked down his face, cutting through the expensive foundation he wore. He nodded slowly. The untouchable boy had finally been touched by the cold, hard hand of accountability. I felt a sense of peace settle over the room, the kind of peace that only comes when the scales finally find their balance. The sound of the gavel's final crack seemed to linger in the air long after the bailiff led Julian Vane out of the room. He didn't fight. He didn't argue. He walked out with his head down, a young man who had finally discovered that his family's shadow wasn't large enough to hide him from the truth. Catherine Vane had already vanished. her heels a fading echo in the hallway, leaving her son to face the world he had spent 24 years mocking. I sat in my chambers for a long time after that session. The room was quiet. The only sound, the soft ticking of the clock Sarah gave me for our 25th anniversary. I thought about Julian. I thought about the thousands of hours he would spend at that hospital. I wondered if he would truly change, or if he was just waiting for the 6 months to pass so he could return to his McLaren and his digital throne. But then I thought about Elias Thorne. 6 months later, on a warm Tuesday in May, I had to visit the VA hospital for a routine checkup. As I walked toward the entrance, the same entrance Julian had blocked, I saw a young man in a simple blue volunteer vest. He was bent over, carefully adjusting the footrest on an elderly man's wheelchair. He was listening, really listening, as the veteran told a story about a rainy night in 1968. The young man didn't have a phone in his hand. He didn't have a $15,000 suit. His hands were tucked into his pockets, and he looked tired. But for the first time, he looked like a man who was part of something bigger than himself. It was Julian. He didn't see me, and I didn't stop to talk. I didn't need to. The work was doing what no checkbook ever could. I've been on this bench for 38 years because I believe that justice isn't about punishment. It's about restoration. It's about reminding us that we are all connected by a thread of shared humanity. My father was right. The law is a mirror. If you don't like what you see, don't break the mirror, change the person standing in front of it. If this story touched your heart, if you believe that character is the only currency that truly matters, then I ask you to do one thing: share this message. Hit that subscribe button and join our community of people who still believe in accountability and compassion. Leave a comment below and tell me, have you ever seen someone finally learn the lesson they needed? I read every single one. And remember, as you go out into the world today, respect costs nothing, but its value is infinite. Be kind to one another. God bless you all.